Welcome to the Foreign Desk Podcast. I'm Lisa Daftari, and here we are, day one of a President Biden. And we want to dive right in. Already, pen to paper, President Biden, on the afternoon of his inauguration, signed several executive orders into effect, perhaps a sign of things to come in the next 100 days or beyond for 4 years. And to break this all down, we want to talk about, is this just an about face of the Trump presidency, or are we going to see some real thought out policy? I want to bring in policy analyst Michael Johns, who's also the national co-founder and leader of the Tea Party movement, former White House speechwriter to President George H.W. Bush, and brilliant guy overall. So thank you for being here with us today.
Hey, it's a real pleasure, Lisa. Thanks for all you've been doing. Been following your work for a long time on Middle East and North Africa, and really, I think you've made some phenomenal contributions. And so it's an honor to join you.
What a day! What a week! What a year! Right? Where do we start on all of this? I want to start with.
Want me to give you an opportunity? Want me to answer that question?
Sure. Go ahead.
We're less than 24 hours into Biden's, we're a little more than 24 hours into his presidency, 26 hours. Of course, one of the first steps he took was putting in the mandatory coronavirus masks for any individual on federal property, and he has already violated his own executive order. I got to be honest with you. My general sense of this is like, often you look at these administrations, and I know there's a lot of anxiety that gets created. And look, we lived through the night. It's a new day. We got a very strong country in a lot of ways. I don't want to, play up people's fears. But the reality is, as we pointed out, and I pointed out emphatically during this campaign, this man is taking us in all the wrong directions, in my judgment.
Well, let's talk about these things specifically. I know, yes, COVID, there's at least 10 different executive orders with regards to COVID. I read through some of them. It is, yes, wearing a mask, ordering companies to create more masks. As I went down the list of these executive orders, I thought to myself, are these actual issues that we're having? Is there a mask shortage? Are people not actually wearing a mask on a public bus or a train or on an airplane? Because I've been on all of those things and I've not seen that. Is this just smoke and mirrors? Is this to say, well, thank God you voted for me because I'm going to stop COVID and these are the things that I'm going to do?
Well, in addition to everything else I've done, I've spent about 20 years in healthcare management. And, I have to say, if you really looked at the beginning parts of this and said, let's listen to the science on masks, it was not at all clear cut. And well, it actually was clear cut. I mean, the World Health Organization and the CDC both had a position on masks all the way up to spring, saying, do not purchase a mask. We need them for healthcare providers. Right. And so it's really been, I hate to say it, but it's evolved into a political prop. It was utilized heavily by Biden. I mean, I saw Biden last night sitting there in the Oval Office, no one else seemingly around with the mask on. I mean, it's become a contemporary means of communicating. Look how much trouble we're in. No one denies the seriousness of this pandemic. Right. Right. But I don't think you can deny either the seriousness that President Trump brought to it, all the way back to trying to get the CDC into Wuhan January 3 when they said no. I mean, I just got off debating some political science professor who said there was no plan. Of course, there's no plan. I mean, COVID wasn't known until it was known. But there was a plan as it related to steps that would be taken. The first one was to get the CDC in there, and China prevented it. China has still been obstructing, even the World Health Organization obstructing. They've done everything that they could from the very beginning of this to make it as painful and difficult as possible on individuals. This is, it's part of a biological warfare program that they've been developing in Wuhan for a long time. There are a lot of questions about it. We've had, the United States, at least intelligence-wise, plenty of concerns about it. And, can you believe, just to ask you a question, that we just sat through an inaugural address yesterday where this president said that the The biggest threat we face as a country is political or white extremist political terrorism. I mean, I'm not diminishing it. I'm sure it exists. I don't personally run into any of these people, but China China is going to be the defining issue of the rest of our lifetimes. It's going to present a major threat, and holding them accountable on this should be priority one, and getting their cooperation. You know, if he's the great diplomat that he contends he is, and he certainly is, he and his family have pocketed plenty of money from the Communist Party of China, you think there would be some degree of cooperation there. I'm not, you know, you think you'd be right on top of that. I just very confused priorities and very political, I think.
Yeah, it's amazing how many distractions there are. Obviously, you said it perfectly in the sense that we don't deny that there is this extremism. We see it in Portland. We saw it at the Capitol. We see it on both sides, and we've been very quick to condemn it. But to say that that is the biggest issue of our times, and then people fall for it, it's just like the global warming issue. You know, no one's saying it doesn't exist. It's just saying that that's not what's going to keep me up at night when I know that Iran is on the 1 yard line from getting a nuclear bomb. When I know that, as you said, China, whether they manufactured this virus or are not complying with their transparency, in both cases, we have an enemy, and they are not, working together with us to fix the situation. Since you do have a background in policy, you were close to the White House for a very long time and working for think tanks, and you have a background in healthcare. Do you actually think that there was something more that Donald Trump could have done, whether it was in the rhetoric, in his actions, or in the optics?
I was a supporter of the daily press conferences. I thought they were largely net positive, but there were some comments that were made in there that have been obviously exploited by his political opponents. I mean, you'll notice on a lot of issues that we're confronting right now, that whenever you engage with Trump opponents, they just sort of take it as for granted that these things were mismanaged or would have been better managed under someone else's watch. And I mentioned going into Wuhan on January 3 and the fact that we're that early on I don't believe we had a documented death from COVID yet at that point, where Peter Navarro and others were telling the president, look, this is a major problem. And it was, a lot of other establishment listened to the science folks who had a very different view about that. And then we had the January 30 puts the travel ban in place. How many lives did that travel ban save? I mean, it's tough to guess. It's not a small number. I mean, and from what Biden said that he opposed it, called it racist and xenophobic, not a constructive addition. Of course, there was really no media coverage of this guy for the entire campaign out of his Wilmington, Delaware basement. So he would make comments like that. No one would say, hey, at what point, was it April or May or July, did you finally conclude that this was not racist and xenophobic and actually was a very constructive, maybe the most constructive step that could be taken in containing the growth of this pandemic? And then you go and look at, the mass mobilization of health resources across this country and what the president did, the public-private partnerships, which, trust me, are not easy to put together, particularly when they haven't had a history of working on this particular issue. And then you're dealing with technology companies that by and large didn't support the president in a lot of cases. And most importantly, you get a vaccine developed for a novel virus in a year. That's unheard. It literally is a record. I mean, usually a vaccine is about a 10-year process. And, even the more seemingly easy vaccines like the MMR vaccine that's been used for a long time was 3 or 4 years in development. So if you drill down on these guys and you say, what would you like? What would he have done that would have satisfied you? Where you would have said, Donald Trump did a pretty good job. Yeah, we lost 400,000 lives. No one can diminish that. And it's tough to go around saying I did a great job when you got 400,000 people who died. Right. Even though there's questions about those statistics. I have to say on the major presidential decisions, because not all of this is contained in the Oval Office. There were all sorts of other components, including decisions that governors made that were ill-advised. and including obviously clinical decisions that were made on the fly.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to give him generally a high grade, and I know that's really bothersome to a lot of his opponents. But honestly, it did change this election cycle, no doubt about it. I mean, I think absent COVID, I don't think any doubt that this president would have been reelected in a landslide. He may have been reelected in a landslide anyway. I don't know.
Right. Well, it seems that way, as close as he did come. Let me go down the list of executive orders that were signed yesterday, and I want to get your opinion on this. So canceling the Keystone XL pipeline, that was very, very, very troublesome to Canada, our neighbor, and obviously a lot of jobs here in the U.S. Extending the moratorium.
Jobs.
Yeah.
You sign that, you got to tell those tens of thousands of Americans who are going to lose their jobs out of that pipeline what they're supposed to be doing. Where do they go? How do they pay their mortgage payment, their electric bill? You know, because these things flippantly are signed in the interest of some usually ill-defined environmental objective. It's not even really fully understood by the people, and no one ever addresses the serious downside that that's going to present, and for gas prices and other energy.
And Canada has brought to the attention of the United States that they have worked on ameliorating a lot of those emission problems, and that it is not as bad as once thought. Let me go down the list here, and then we'll have a conversation about all of them. Extending the moratorium on mortgage and rent, advancing racial equity, strengthening DACA, overturning the ban on sanctuary cities getting federal grants, rejoining the Paris Climate Accord, no surprise there, ending the travel ban, stopping border wall construction. The list goes on, but those are some of the more prominent ones. Was there anyone on that list that surprised you yesterday?
No, I think, honestly, it's tough to be too critical. I mean, I think they're bad policy decisions. But they're political decisions. It's about getting rid of the Trump legacy. And in fairness, Trump, when he came in, looked at a whole series of executive orders that he signed, that he put into place, including that travel ban as one example, that were designed to move the country in his direction. And that's, we say elections have consequences. That's what we're talking about. So, we have this travel ban. By the way, it's not a Muslim ban. I mean, how do you have...
No, it's not.
I don't want to get into too much like inside baseball because people may not know it, but the new White House press secretary has a purportedly deep level of expertise in foreign affairs, having worked at the State Department and in a spokesperson role. Don't think much of her positions or her thoughtfulness in these issues, but she certainly knows that the largest Muslim countries of the world, and ballpark 9/10 of Muslims in the world, have been exempted from this travel ban. And even the travel ban it's not Muslim, and it's not a ban either. It addresses suspensions or footnotes, kind of provisions that are required. I was very disappointed in the way that was so you can get up there and give this great unity speech about how we need to bring everybody together. Give me a chance. You'll see I'm a good-hearted guy. No, you really, you went on the rest of that speech and you labeled your political enemies racist, basically. And now you send your press secretary down to completely misrepresent the president's agenda, which on this travel ban, which was designed to protect the American people. And by the way, there again, where's the explanation? So, okay, if he feels that we can bring people in from Mogadishu, Somalia, who have literally no records at all to provide when they go to get a visa, and they can just sort of fly here, I would like to hear where's the question mark to him as to what sort of safety guarantees can he give the American people in the absence of Trump's thoughtful travel ban, that the repeal of that is not dangerous from the standpoint of terrorism or any one of the series of problems that can emerge from it.
Right. Of all the policies, I mean, we don't know much. I mean, other than what was reversed yesterday, as you said, the Biden campaign didn't do much of campaigning up to the election. They campaigned on not being Donald Trump, and mentioned obviously the COVID stats. And the one thing that they did mention over and over again that we had some idea about is the Iran nuclear deal, getting back involved in that. You know, put this on the same list as maybe the immigration policies. We have a migrant caravan on the way here. We already had a Biden official tell them, right now is not the best time. Even though, why would they get going? Because they know that, or they believe that the Biden administration will be much more kind to them in terms of letting in the migrants. But when push comes to shove, do you believe that this administration will continue with their ideology, or will the actual facts and reality perhaps change that approach?
Do you mean ideology on Iran? Or
In general, this is
yeah,
let's go issue by issue, because I know that you know a great deal about each one. Let's start with the Iran nuclear deal. Will they get back into a deal, even though we're not even dealing with? The evidence was bad under Obama, and he still pushed through a deal. The evidence is worse today than it was then. Are we going to push through it for a deal?
The Iran deal, as President Trump correctly described, is one of the worst deals ever concocted in the history of America, global foreign affairs. It really, let's just start with its ability to contain nuclear weapons development, which ostensibly was the main goal. What sort of agreement precludes you from being able to inspect military sites where, quite logically, nuclear weapons development would occur?
Right.
And what sort of agreement provides, you would probably know better than I was it 28, 29 days advance notice requirement to be able to look at that? No, if you're not developing it, it should be spot notices. You arrive whenever you want, you send whoever you want. Right. You send UN inspectors, you send US inspectors. We're not developing nuclear weapons. You're welcome to come look wherever you want in the country. When you start putting in provisions like, we need 29 days advance notice, and you can't look in these logical areas where we would probably develop this weapons program, you're doing it because you got something to hide. That's fact. And then all of the intelligence information, as you well know, that's developed really since the signing of that agreement, and even before, it has been that Iran has been on an aggressive nuclear weapons development program. This is a regime that's on the verge of collapse, quite honestly. They don't have a whole lot going. They're increasingly isolated in the region. China, I'm amazed, even with their alliance now, I don't know if you call it alliance, their strong relationship with China. Here's the country that is indisputably the largest repressor of Muslim human rights in the world, with the treatment of millions of Uyghurs in concentration camps and being detained and tortured, and the atrocities go on and on. I would encourage every American, if you don't know about the Uyghurs, to go out and educate yourself. We said never again after the Holocaust, and this is never again. It's happening. And kudos to Mike Pompeo and the Trump State Department for labeling this genocide, because that's the exact word to describe it. But who are Iran's friends, really? It's like it's a hybrid of the worst tyrannies in the world. They're isolated in the region, and so there's that. Then you look at obviously the part that got the most attention. Was it the 1.7 billion, I think, roughly ballpark, that was brought in there in the private airplanes and unloaded to the mullahs of Iran. And then, hey, surprise, the regional terrorism, the global terrorism by Iran, which is the largest state-sponsored terrorism in the world, intensifies dramatically. I think an 11th grader would probably understand the correlation between affording a regime of such malevolent intent with resources like that, with the fact that they're going to go do bad things with it. For the life of me, I almost wish I could sit down with, the Ben Rhodes and the other people whose names most wouldn't recognize, but who I know were behind this whole thing. So what were you thinking? Was it really designed ultimately to empower that regime and to encourage these behaviors? Because it's tough to sort of come up with a benign explanation of it. And then, of course, the domestic human rights crisis in Iran troubles me greatly. And, human rights didn't get a whole lot of concern in this last 4 years in Iran, but I spoke out on a lot of these executions. I've been following them. We've had some, and I'm sure you've been involved, probably more than I have been even. But we've had some success stories and we've had some failures. And the one lesson I've taken away from it is that if the world unites on these issues and speaks out, you don't have to do everything, but just if you can just do a little, this regime is going to be responsive. They are acutely aware that they have a very bad image on the world scene.
Right, absolutely. I mean, how they react to those human rights cases is actually exactly correlated to their positioning on the global stage. If they feel like they don't have an ally or a friend or somewhere to thump their chest, they respond totally differently. I want
one other thing that I thought was of interest. In fact, I'm curious what your thought is on it. Is that the Saudis have an interesting position on this agreement, and that is that if the U.S. does in fact go back into it, which is very ill-advised, and I hope that doesn't occur, I think we should continue the maximum pressure. But I know that that's not what this band of characters now at the State Department and White House are all about, and the NSC. But if we are going to go back in it, I mean, the Saudis are like, well, we want to be a part of it as well. And I think that's probably constructive. I mean, because one of the great risks of Iran developing a nuclear weapon is not just the fact that they would use it to intimidate countries all over the world, possibly including our own, and certainly Israel, but also that it's going to spur an arms race in the Middle East, last thing we need in that region. I mean, how Saudi Arabia, if you're in Riyadh and you're getting hit by, missiles being sent out of Yemen by Houthi rebels supported by Iran, I mean, what level of tolerance are they ultimately supposed to have toward this level of aggression that's been directed at them? Oh, obviously, there's a limit to it. And nuclear weapons in the hands of Iran and not in the hands of Saudi Arabia, I know from the standpoint of the Saudi government, would leave them feeling very vulnerable.
Oh, absolutely. And, there are so many different proxy wars that Iran is involved in, and to pass along, there's so many scenarios. I mean, being, in some sort of heightened tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, you have them passing the scenario of them passing it along to Hezbollah or Hamas to use it against Israel. There's so many different scenarios. They're in Iraq already. They have a stronghold there.
They killed Americans in Iraq.
They did, of course, they did.
I realize for a lot of Americans, this is far away, and they may not recognize a lot of these opposition forces, these terrorist organizations. They're bad guys, almost without exception. But what you need to know, and this was the justification, I think, that certainly made the killing of General Soleimani very warranted, the head of the IRGC in Iran, was the fact that they were behind a lot of the killings of Americans in Iraq. And whatever your view is on the invasion of Iraq, and I certainly have taken a lot of reservations back from where I was originally based on, like everybody else, I kind of looked at it and took what I was hearing out of Bush 43's administration's announcements about it, with the utmost credibility. In retrospect, it might have been, probably was a mistake, but it was made much more costly to the United States because of Iran's malevolent involvement.
Right. And on every level. I mean, when people on the left are for an Iran deal, the only reason I could see in their minds to go, back into an Iran deal would be despite Donald Trump. Other than that, it offers nothing to particularly those on the left who believe in women's rights, who believe in human rights, who believe in freedom of religion and freedom of speech and freedom to protest and everything else.
Well, as you well know, what's complicated about it is the agreement does in fact exist, right? I mean, you still have the EU in it. So Iran is already obligated to, keep its commitments that it's got within that constraint. And a lot of, I'm sure you and I are on the same page on this, saying, what are you doing? Why is the EU engaged in this level of trade? Why are you empowering this regime to do bad things? And So it's not like we're really gaining any extra level of protection that really what you're doing is giving a green light to big companies to go trade with Iran. I mean, what other benefit are we deriving from going back into the agreement?
Oh, absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. And the pressure campaign is it's working. Look, when people in Iran actually tell me that they are for the pressure campaign, even though it's making their lives more miserable in every way, because as we know, those sanctions are always passed on to the people. It's always the main street economy that gets affected. But what they say is that it's almost like they're willing to bear that discomfort or the hardship for there to be actual change for them. And for them, the only change is regime change. It's not this reform or, give them more money. Where are they going to put it? They're not going to give it to the people of Iran.
That's the point. And that's like what I think one of the big challenges we have politically in the United States right now is explaining these.
Exactly right.
Conservatism is sort of, I really think in a lot of ways is oversimplification, but like progressivism is kind of like checkers and conservatism is kind of chess. Like you got to think like a little more about and a little deeper about some of these issues. But, on this particular theme, I mean, it's just should be self-evident that it's destructive. How are you going to trade with a regime, a totalitarian regime that will do just about anything to its own people? I mean, that you personally know the magnitude of atrocities that have occurred.
I think, but I would say,
all the way back to the 1979 revolution. You're right, and I know you're a personal affiliation with that. How is it possible that you would think that regime is ever going to take any of the benefits that it derives from trade relations with Western democracies and utilize it to the benefit of their people? Of course, they're not going to do that.
Right.
And they never have.
And I to kind of piggyback on your last thought, I actually thought that the biggest weakness of the Trump presidency was that lack of explanation, because it just made, I don't know if it would have helped, because I think from day one, he was dead on arrival, particularly to the mainstream media that controlled the narrative. But with a lot of the foreign policy moves, I thought he had always made the right decision, but yet he was always criticized. Had he explained maybe the travel ban better, you tell the people in America, we can't call the DMV in Russia to vet this individual, so we cannot take the chance of him blowing up your child's baseball game. And that's what it comes down to, or with Iran, we can't give them, bags of cash. They're not going to spend it on the people of Iran. The people of Iran are telling us they're going to go spend it on terrorism. So we can't do that.
Even now, look at the people that are calling it a Muslim ban. I mean, you've got like White House correspondents. I mean,
absolutely. Or you have groups like Code Pink.
I know better. And it's like, okay, now all of a sudden you're an apparatchik in the Democrat Party and you're fighting the same ideological warfare that the administration is. I mean,
or they called him a warmonger for years and years, but yet when he wanted to reduce our troop presence in the Middle East, it was like, oh no, that might be it.
What wars did he start? I mean, first president in a long, long time not to initiate any major conflict abroad. That's real serious accomplishment for this president. Look, it was a very now that it's over. I went through 4 years knowing that we needed this man in the White House. I endorsed him on day one, June 16th, 2015. Nobody was earlier to the party, and in part because for the same reason many Tea Party leaders and even some of my colleagues who were co-founders gravitated to politicians that we elected, like Ted Cruz, like Marco Rubio, like Rand Paul. I sort of knew that we needed something completely out of the box, that we needed somebody who literally did not care what opposition or names were called, he was called, or what sort of, basically static that he confronted as he went about his. I knew that whoever was there would have confronted these same issues. They would have been different ones, but it would have been 4 years of opposition. I knew this guy was singularly positioned to be able to take it, and he did. To be flying off with three major Republicans who should have been right by his side, thanking him for his service and thanking him for allowing them to serve, not being there. What an extraordinary stab in the back. So I think like on that, and then on the fact that he was able to bring, and I don't want to underestimate this because I think it's huge. He was really singularly among those candidates, I guess Rubio's come around now, and I'm impressed with his thinking and commentary on this, but he got China. He got China back in the 1980s.
Oh, yes.
He knew what the CCP were about. He knew that the dangers that they were presented. He understood these trade imbalances were decimating to American jobs, and these jobs weren't coming back once we lost them.
Yep.
And he gave him a lot of props for that. And then the trade and immigration issues. I mean, would we have ever been talking about immigration ever in our lifetime if it weren't for Trump?
Right. You know, I've always said those who loved him loved what he did, and those who didn't like him didn't like what he said. And it's unfortunate because, you know, those actions are very, very important. And he was always America first, always.
Definitely. I concede, even as a purported expert on this, and as somebody very close to the president and the administration, that I have to say, I mean, if you ask me to really articulate what these guys as a body didn't like about why they hated him so much, I guess it'd be a hybrid of issues. I think it was in part that they didn't trust him because he hadn't been there for a long time. And, you're president of the United States, you walk in day one, you're given a lot of information.
Right.
A lot of information, things that go on in this world that you couldn't possibly imagine, that they didn't trust him with.
When you say they, are you talking about the media? Are you talking about the deep state? Are you talking about the
intel community predominantly?
Right.
Which, if you were going to look at a deficiency of the president of the last 4 years and say, hey, what could have been done differently? I think you hit the one thing, and that was, like in that campaign, was it a good idea to have come out and said, announcing a Muslim ban? No, he gave birth to that phrase. It didn't exist beforehand. He never implemented it, and the communications on it could have been a lot better and should have been more assertive, saying, do not use this phrase, does not apply. Right. Otherwise, Indonesia would be in there as the
right. And North Korea and Venezuela would not, because as far as I know, they are not Muslim countries.
That's right. In fact, we can go through about the top 5 or so that are exempted from it. And there were real, and by the way, what the origin of those 7 were. I mean, it was from the Obama administration.
Sure. Exactly right.
Through, their national security personnel who reviewed basically their airport procedures and processes and their visa screenings and concluded there literally were none in a lot of these countries. I mentioned Somalia because it's one of the most glaring examples. There aren't really health records in Somalia. There aren't really records of incarceration or people's ideological radicalization. And, so if you just want to roll the dice and say, hey, come on in, because I don't know why, come on in.
Right. Just because you have to see.
As Biden has now done, it's just a roll of the dice. And, we've had, I think, a sufficient number of experiences with this by now that we should be on guard, and we're not. I worked for governor of the great state of New Jersey that you and I have logged some time in, and Tom Kean, who was chair of the 9/11 Commission. And as you know, that was one of the prime components of the 9/11 Commission. Get control of the overstayed visas, right? There were really a number of takeaways. Get the intel agencies working together because they were working in silos. They weren't sharing information, okay? So all these truthers have it wrong, okay? Al-Qaeda launched 9/11, and they did it to advance their radical Islamic agenda. But there were signs beforehand of a coming crisis that could have been more broadly shared in the government and weren't. And that's been part of the longstanding governmental, I don't know what you would call it, firewalls between all of these intel agencies. Maybe we don't need, what are there, 27 intel agencies? Maybe we don't need 27 intel agencies. Maybe 5 would be sufficient.
Well, that's not going to be changed in the next 4 years. Maybe after that. I want to get your thoughts on, what will Trump's legacy be? It's a tough question because I want to ask you, it's a 2-part question. What would Trump's legacy be before the Capitol Hill event and now once he left yesterday?
I really think they were very determined not to send him off with the message to the rest of this country. Don't anyone else be stupid enough to come down here talking about draining the swamp, because we will make your life miserable. So they found an opportunity there. It turned out to be completely misguided. This should be, in a court of law, which in a way the Senate impeachment trial is supposed to be loosely modeled on, you would have a summary judgment of dismissal. Why would you have a summary judgment? Because the thesis in the House impeachment articles was that the president of the United States incited the violence with the speech he gave at the ellipse. Well, now we have documented, in fact, the Washington Post even reported on it, and it's in the federal FBI's investigation, that this thing was like 2 weeks in the making. The individuals who were involved in it had already decided to do it long before Trump got up and talked, by the way, in case we need to remind people, about peacefully and patriotically marching to the Capitol. There were no references of breaking windows, no references to entering the place illegally, and lots of questions, frankly. I mean, why would the doors opened?
Right.
I realized I made some personnel changes there, but
yeah, we had Elijah Schaffer on the show, and he talked about there's an order to stand down. I mean, there's a lot of questions. More questions than answers, and
and importantly, which we have to point out now, at least two Antifa and BLM affiliated Trump opponents. I mean, it's fair to call them that, right? Violent Trump opponents who were very involved in leadership capacities of that. So was it, it's wrong to say it was an Antifa BLM thing. I'm not saying that, but it's also wrong to say that it was a Trump.
Well, even if you look at the numbers, and I know the journalists are never the ones to really get numbers, but if you look at the numbers, and I was always a math nerd, so this was my first question: how many people actually went into the Capitol? How many people were there in total? How many people were violent? And it comes down to, from my previous guest who was actually there reporting, it was about 2 to 3% of the people who attended were actually violent and did all this. So to sweep now,
they weren't even at the rally. Many of them were there because Trump started at 11 a.m. I think, and then he was a little late. Many of them were already down there at 11 a.m.
Nobody says this was okay.
45.
Nobody says this was okay, but to sweep, 75 million people who voted for Trump, and now we have like McCarthyism going on in this country to say you're going to lose your job, you're going to be, if you're affiliated even with this movement, which brings me to my final question. It's so difficult for young people to stay on with the GOP when there are so many repercussions, when there is such a backlash, when they are making it that you really can't be, either you have to be closeted or you have to switch parties. What does the future of the GOP look like for you?
Well, I've found, and I'm sure you have too, that like media and those who haven't really been close to kind of the Trump movement have just always sort of thrown in our face anytime a Republican has criticized or done anything negative that related to Trump. But Trump, if you go back to 2016, let's remember, he ran as an insurgent candidate against the Republican Party for the nomination, but against the establishment, even though he ended up hiring Reince Priebus and, with a lot of those things I think were ultimately mistakes. But you cannot look at his legacy. And in fact, he emphasized this in his departure, that this coalition it's Republicans, it's independents, it's some Democrats who have become uncomfortable with the party of Davos and, the Silicon Valley censorship and not looking out for the working man and woman like the Democrat Party historically did back in the JFK and earlier years. This is a whole new Democrat Party. And that's really been, I'm not saying that there's not a lot of blame to go around and even some on our side, but if you want to kind of get to the heart of what the ideological divide is and the partisan divide in this country, it's been the evolution of this party, which is nothing like what it was several decades ago. The things it stands for are things the American people don't stand for. And they're being thrust upon the American people secretly, privately, quietly, sometimes illegally.
You think Trump will go off and start his Patriot Party?
Here's my advice, and I will share this prominently and confidentially, and publicly and confidentially. And that is that if you even look at the 2020 race and you took that libertarian candidate and assigned those votes to Trump in a few of those states, I did the math. It didn't put him over 270 electoral college votes, but he would have won a few of those states if those libertarian votes had gone 100% for him, which I think they would have. I mean, what libertarian is going to vote for more taxes and regulations, as Biden's promising? So I think when you start another right of center party, and now you have two right of center parties, you're splitting that vote, basically. Now, whether that he might think, well, I can split it 70-30, not 50-50 or 60-40. But even at 70-30, it's not enough. And he just showed, even with the whole party behind him, presumably
how close it was,
that it wasn't enough. So we need to be, I think, rebranding the party, taking the party over. And this is one thing that frustrates me immensely, is to hear from people, well, we're going to go start this Patriot party. I'm like, have you attended your local GOP?
Did you ever read about Ross Perot?
Yeah, did you ever hear about Perot? I lost my job because of that guy. All right.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, I mean, that the lesson that existed in November of 1992, and you could find many other examples throughout American political history, that I do understand that the idea of more parties is appealing. And I suspect people on the left think that way too. But ultimately, if the goal is to say we don't want to just be a party of symbolism, we want to be a party of political relevance, and we want to be able to win,
right?
We want to stand for something meaningful, then you have to reform and restructure that party. And sadly, we're dealing with people that are just they're disgusted with a number. And let's be clear, they're not, when they say they're disgusted with the GOP, they're disgusted with Mitch McConnell, and they're disgusted with Kevin McCarthy, and they're disgusted with, if McConnell votes for impeachment, I mean, this thing's going to snowball, and it's going to unravel real quickly.
There's going to be repercussions. Yeah,
and I know Mitch McConnell since 1990s. There was no high crime and misdemeanor. I also know you want Trump gone, and you don't want him returning. You vote for impeachment, knowing that the facts don't support it. This country is going to pull the rug underneath you. And
exactly right.
Every Republican in Congress. That's why the Tea Party movement took momentum.
Right.
We will primary these people, and we will win. And if you think that's, go ask Eric Cantor about our ability to do that.
They're reminding the American people of why Trump was elected in the first place. This is the same political games that Americans are sick of on both sides.
Hey, one of the unknown stories is never reported in the media. Donald Trump in 2011 spoke at a Tea Party rally in Boca Raton, Florida. I think you can still find it on YouTube. He got in his car after that event and said, wow, that was amazing. And I've always speculated, and several people close have sort of validated this with me, that event sort of shaped his idea of how a campaign would be structured. The populist rally-based nature of it, which was, let's face it, unconventional, right? And didn't see Romney, McCain, or George W. Bush doing that, and they couldn't have drawn those crowds anyway. Right. But there's that, and then of course Obama making fun of him at that Washington Correspondents' Dinner. I think internally the rage just sort of built up in his system, and he said, "I'm going to show you."
Far be it from me to quote Michael Moore, but he did say before the election, he said the difference between the left and the right is that Trump supporters will drive 500 miles to attend a Trump rally, but Biden supporters won't even go 5 miles to go to a Biden rally. And that's exactly right. He was loved and supported by his base, and he really evolved the way that he campaigned, the way he ran his presidency.
He left with 51% approval rating in this country. Okay, so all of this depiction of Barack Obama as being this greatly popular political figure, roughly equivalent figures, all right? They had very strong bases of support, and they had very strong bases of opposition.
Right. Unfortunately,
he'll be back. I hope he'll be back.
Yeah.
I urge him to come back.
Well, he's definitely a one who can garner support and with his loyal base. And I hope we'll have better days ahead. 4 years of hopefully unity. When people say it, I hope they mean it, and I hope they work towards it on both sides. And thank you so much, Michael Johns, for being here with us. You're wonderful. I want to actually plug some of your accounts because you are wonderful, wonderful on Twitter. You must follow Michael Johns on Twitter, Parler when it comes hopefully back up, Facebook as well, and his YouTube page. You can subscribe, YouTube/Michael Johns, see his work over there. And you'll definitely have to promise to come back on with us, Michael.
I really appreciate all the truth you've been talking about, some really important issues. Very much appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Hopefully we'll see you soon. And thank you for tuning in. We hope that you will sign up for our daily top 10. Go to foreigndesknews.com/newsletter to be informed of all the day's headlines there, as well as our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Lisa Daftari. We hope you have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next week.